Hi. So the book I'm going to review today is called Design in Nature by, I believe it's Adrian Bejan. I'm just going to pop up a picture of the cover here. I don't know what happened to my own copy of this book, which is why I'm just showing a picture of the cover here. But this is I find this to be really a very underappreciated book for how obscure it is and how useful I found it. But I think it can be accounted for. The author talks about design as the proper balancing of force flows through a system. Balancing is maybe not the correct term. He makes the point that force flowing through a system will always minimize the amount of resistance that it encounters, and that this accounts for the characteristic shape of what we call organic shapes in nature. And he makes the point that these are the way they are in response to how force flows affect them. So you can see on the title, he's got a picture of a tree, and on the other side, he's got a picture of a lightning bolt. And you can see that there's some real similarity between these. Well, the author makes the point that the look of a lightning bolt as electrical energy moves through the atmosphere, and the look of a tree as water moves from the ground upward, that those are both systems that need to move, in one case water, in another case, electric charge, and that there are characteristic ways that happens, and that's why a tree and a lightning bolt have similarities. I found this to be a very, very helpful book for any time that I have to do design, because the author talks in a very intuitive way about the fact that there are ideal balance points, and that one can minimize the resistance that flow encounters in moving through a system, that force flows encounter moving through a system, I should say. And that this is what accounts for that typical organic look that we see in nature, and that it's also the most efficient way to design our own systems. And he not only gives, if you read the book, he not only gives a lot of basis for an intuitive understanding and appreciation for that, he links it very effectively to a mathematical basis for making those kinds of decisions. So I remember, for example, I was at this talk by a fellow engineer and an Olympic rower. So he was on the Canadian Olympic team, and he was presenting on this project he did, where he was looking where to place his hands on his oars. So his coach had told him, I think, to hold it a third of the way in. And he asked, well, why? And the coach just kind of looked at him funny and went to the door and said, well, if I pull at the end of the door, I get a lot more leverage than if I pull at the middle. That seemed a little unsatisfying to him, so he did quite a bit of research to find the correct distance to hold the oars out from the end. Like you can see, if you hold an oar like this, it won't work that well. You hold it all the way out at the end, you have to move your body a lot more. So he did this research. His coach turned out to be pretty spot on. Not entirely, actually, and I would guess that was because kind of the center of momentum of the paddle at the end of the oar wasn't quite where the coach was assuming. He was just kind of assuming that the length of the oar was either where the paddle started or where the paddle ended, or maybe even in the middle, but it wasn't even in the middle, because the paddle wasn't regularly shaped, So anyway, I think if the coach had known the exact length from the center of where force translated from the water to the paddle, I think 1/3 of the way in would have been pretty much exactly on. And I think the reason that this intuition was correct was for something that the author would have definitely jumped on. But the coach didn't have the mathematical background to explain that, well, the force of you pulling at this end has to be balanced by the force pushing at this end. And if one of those has more force on it, then there'll be just there'll be essentially a choke point in the transition of force through the system, and you want to minimize choke points of transitions of force, and that's why things take on the shape they take on in an evolutionary system like nature. And it's why you can make a prediction about where to hold an oar, because you can look at the balance of forces, and if you've read a book like this, you have an understanding of where these kinds of choke points or points of failure can show up. Now, I think the author does himself a disservice by speaking in somewhat grandiose terms about having discovered a law of nature. I don't know whether he's right or wrong in a technical sense, but having read the book, what I think he's done is speak in a very intuitively satisfying and mathematically rigorous way about design and about balancing forces, and why we should take the flow of forces through systems into account when we're designing either the systems or a component of those systems. I think it's a fantastic book. I don't know whether calling it a law of nature is entirely necessary, and I think that might be why it's been dismissed a little, because it is an excellent handbook for design. It really helps you think about designing for force flows, or designing anything where force will be active. And then again, I mean, I think maybe the talk of it being a law of nature, previously undiscovered law of nature, does maybe also help the intuition latch onto this and take it as seriously as it should be taken. It's just, after having read the book, most of what's valuable in it seems just so common sense. And I suppose, I mean, you discover the law of gravity, that must have also seemed very common sense at the time. So maybe I'm doing a disservice to the author, but I think it does account for why maybe the book has been dismissed, because the phenomena that the author points to are so universal that while they may qualify for the formal definition of a law of nature, it seems more like a very good conceptual framework. And maybe that is what a law of nature is. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not really sure what they do. But the book is very fantastic. And I'll just give one example of how I've used it. So in my day job, I design fiber optic networks, which have a very similar kind of structure to the riverbeds, the trees, the lightning bolts that he talks about. There's a thick central thing which branches off, and the thing is, thinking about things in terms of what the author calls the constructal law, the fact that one wants to, I guess, minimize friction and resistance. And he also talks very usefully about economies of scale and why economies of scale work the way they do. That's actually, if I track my copy down, I should really revisit that part, because I can't give a useful definition of that, except insofar as if something is larger than, if a larger thing is moving or a larger flow is moving in one direction, it has less internal friction relative to surface area. Yeah, I guess that's a big part of it. Anyway, not to get too much into the weeds here, I have used both the intuitive tools that the author provides here in designing internet infrastructure, but also when I need to get rigorous about why is a particular set of branches better than a different set of branches, the same tools of getting mathematical about it and seeing, well, where are the costs to the system? Thinking in economic terms works just as well for the principles that the author lays out. So all in all, if you're a designer or you're interested in getting into design, I highly recommend this book. Especially if you're the kind of designer that appreciates organic forms in the things that they do, because it really gives a rigorous explanation for why those organic forms are actually the most functional. And it presents them in a way that is satisfying to, one might say, both halves of the brain. They're both intuitively satisfying, and you can also really dig into the mathematics and look at why this design decision versus that one. And it gives also an intuitive framework for how to set those questions up. So not for everyone. It is a technical book. But if you're interested in design, if you want to learn design of any system where there'll be a movement of energy or a transfer of forces, highly recommend it.